It's a combination of greed in financial markets and the total absence of appropriate supervision and regulation of mortgage lending and of the financial system. The regulators were asleep at the wheel because there was an ideology in Washington for the last 6 years of just free market fundamentalism. So really reckless lending practices like a zero down payment when you get a mortgage, or no verification of your income or assets or jobs, these liar loans, or interest rate only mortgages, or negative amortization, or these teaser rates for 2 years. All this stuff that was really reckless and dangerous and predatory was allowed because regulators did not care. I mean, Greenspan himself was the biggest cheerleader of this kind of financial innovation in mortgages and subprime. So the Fed, the regulators, and many others are in part to blame, because a financial market that doesn't have institutional rules and regulation is like the jungle, because greed dominates.
Do you agree with Joseph Stiglitz's speech a few days ago that was widely carried, where he is really blaming Greenspan for a lot of this? That sounds like what you were just doing.
Yeah, I mean, Greenspan and the Fed were part of the problem for two reasons. One, the Fed reduced during the last recession the Fed funds rate to 1% and kept it too low for too long, and that fed the housing bubble. And Greenspan and the Fed and the other regulators ignored these kind of reckless lending practices that were occurring in mortgage and credit market, and not only they ignored it, but they were cheerleading and saying these are great innovations. So certainly Greenspan is partly to blame for it.
But they're not stupid. I mean, yeah. I remember people 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when they started changing all these rules, phasing them in. Ron Paul was saying 20 years ago that this was going to happen, and he even predicted that it would happen in the 2000s. So, I mean, they just recklessly did this? You don't think they had any premeditated idea to just pump out all this liquidity, then they would make personal profits and then leave us with the bag?
Certainly some financial institutions, there was this kind of wrong incentives. They knew that they were gambling for redemption, making risky loans, and then when things go wrong, maybe the Fed comes and eases monetary policy or bails them out. So that's part of the problem, what economists refer as moral hazard. When you have insurance, your behavior is going to be dangerous and reckless. And there is even now expectation in Wall Street of banks and investors are being bailed out by the Fed or by the government. There are already plans for bailing out financial institutions from their own trouble.
Now,
that would be wrong.
Well, I'd like to know why you say it's wrong. I agree with you, because they're going to bail it out by further inflating the currency, which then causes other countries to stop buying the federal securities, which further destroys the country, doesn't it?
Yeah, one of the risks of what's happening right now is that certainly the Fed is now forced to reduce interest rates as a way to avoid a more severe recession, but with lower interest rates, the value of the dollar is falling to historical levels are low, and that fall of the value of the dollar is going to make the value of goods we import from the rest of the world more expensive, and that's going to feed inflation, and that's something we should worry about, and it may lead also foreigners not to want to invest in our securities, and we need their financing because we are still running an $800 billion current account deficit. So a fall that is disorderly of the dollar and a rise in inflation is one of the risks of the mess that we have created.
Professor Roubini, you've written a book that I've read excerpts of, including Bailouts or Bail-ins, Responding to Financial Crises in Emerging Economies, Political Cycles, and it goes on from there. This looks like gunboat diplomacy to me, where the big central banks go in and loan money to third world countries, wink, wink. The dictator doesn't pay it off, then they come in and seize the assets. This just looks like they're treating the U.S. like a third world nation, literally strip mining us, as you said, predatorily, creating a cycle where they get all the power and then implode the economy and pick up the pieces. But you're saying it's also now endangering them. Have they gotten so greedy and so predatory that they may fall into the pit that they dug?
Well, you know, they might be greedy, but part of the problem is we created this mess ourselves. We spent the last 10 years spending more than our income and running the current account deficit, and therefore we have to finance it by foreigners buying and lending us money. Until recently, the foreigners were willing to just buy low-yielding treasury bills. Now they've gotten tired. They said, if we have to finance the United States, we want to buy your land, your firms, your gems, your real assets, and that's the phenomenon of these sovereign wealth funds that are now putting hundreds of dozens of billions of money into the U.S. Equity market or into buying U.S. corporations.
But isn't it
those... As a debtor, if you have to borrow, you cannot be too choosy on whether you're going to borrow in the form of debt or equity, and foreigners now are telling us we're tired of having low-yielding T-bills, we want your assets. And they're right. First, we have to tighten our belt before we can say anything to the foreigners.
Well, that's the same thing, though. A lot of those sovereign wealth, rich elites in Europe, they're the very ones that gave political contributions to the groups that loosened all of the regulatory precautions.
Yeah, I mean, there were lobbyists that were mostly domestic. There were also some foreign ones. Certainly the lobbyists for the financial institutions created this mess in which they said, don't mess with the financial system, don't regulate, don't supervise, market knows best. And unfortunately in financial systems, if you don't have rules and regulations, the law of the jungle, because the greed is the main driver of the decisions of investors. And you need to control that.
Nouriel Roubini, professor of economics, PhD, advises the U.S. government. We've got a quick break and then 5 minutes on the other side. Please stay there, Professor. I want to come back and talk about how what's happening in the U.S. will affect the rest of the world as well. We'll be right back. Nouriel Roubini, PhD, professor of economics, heads up RGEmonitor.com, one of the premier sites out there analyzing global trends in the economy. He's also an author. Put a link up to him on Infowars.com. We've only got a few minutes left with you, sir, and I hope to have you back up in the future. We're honored to have you. In the College of Professors, with your colleagues there in New York and around the world, just a guesstimation, what percentage are saying we're going to have a meltdown or a great danger of a meltdown versus we're just in a recession versus those that say we're not in a recession, that we're in a wonderful economy?
Unfortunately, a majority of professional economists and forecasters are still deluding themselves that we're not going to have a recession. So those who are actually claiming we're going to have a recession are still a minority. Unfortunately, probably they're not talking to the average American because the recession has already started. Every economic indicator you look at shows a downward trend in economic activity, demand, production, employment, sales, and you name it. I think that there is kind of like a disconnect between those who are forecasters and those who are living households in terms of what the potential
well, we've got these forecasters that work for big companies that want to keep putting out the good word, and isn't that political? They don't want the political blame, so they're just telling people you're delusional, the economy's great?
Oh, that's part of it. Part of it is also that, many of these financial institutions are underwriting stocks and bonds, and they don't want their chief economist to say we have a recession. So, there is a little bit of a bias or self-censorship. They're not going to be the first one to claim that we're in trouble because their entire business model is based on an economy is growing. So
globally,
that's the problem.
In closing, sir, globally, other nations aren't going to get out of this scot-free. We have the same crisis in Europe, and then that has ripple effects, doesn't it?
Absolutely. U.S. is about 30% of the global economy, and unfortunately, when the U.S. sneezes, the rest of the world gets the cold, and this time around, the U.S. is not just going to sneeze. It's going to be a severe and protracted case of pneumonia, and therefore, the rest of the world is going to be very negatively affected in terms of their own economic condition and growth by a severe U.S. recession.
Just give us a ballpark number. 10% chance of total meltdown, 20%, 30%, and what will a meltdown look like if it does happen?
A meltdown would take the form of a very severe recession that lasts at least a year and a half or two, in which the financial losses in the financial system are going to be over $1 trillion, and in which millions of households are going to lose their homes. I think that there is at least a 50-50% probability that scenario would happen at this point.
And then there's the cascading effect. With all this inflation, people on fixed incomes are now starting already to become homeless. We see tent cities popping up everywhere. I mean, if Bush says this is a boom economy, I'd hate to see a recession.
Yeah, in a recession, people lose jobs, incomes are not growing, and inflation now is going up. So it's a major squeeze, and certainly those that are at the bottom of the income distribution who have not done very well in the last few years are going to suffer even more. The poor, the homeless, the people who have lower income, and it's going to affect even the middle class. Today there is a middle class malaise because cost of education, cost of healthcare, cost of energy, everything is going up in price, and incomes are not growing very much. So it's not just the working class, it's also the middle classes that are squeezed.
RGEmonitor.com, Nouriel Roubini, we really appreciate you spending time with us, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure being with you today.
Take care.
Yeah.